You're listening to the PropTech Pioneers podcast. This podcast brings startups and MLSs closer together by exploring the beauty and the struggle of real estate data and technology. I believe real estate is on the cusp of a major transformation driven by better access to data, a new crop of pragmatic founders, and pent-up frustration with the status quo. These are conversations with those pioneers that are leading that transformation within the MLS landscape. I'm your host, Evan Knowles. I'm an entrepreneur building a fintech company called Simba that helps realtors manage their financial health using MLS data. And I wish I had access to these conversations earlier in my journey. So I thought I'd help future entrepreneurs and MLS executives learn from each other in a more open and accessible fashion. I hope you enjoy. Now let's jump into it. All right, I'm here with Eileen, Romito, and we're looking forward to talking about today's topic, which is once you get a data feed and you get your product or as a vendor in a market, what do you do next and what kind of intricacies come along with that? So Eileen and I met at a Chicago Association Realtors event. That was one of the first big events that Simba went live at, and Eileen walked up. We had a great conversation, so it was great to connect with another vendor there in the Chicago market. And then we reconnected at the last RESO. You came up and said, hey, love the podcast, which I was super happy with because I had just released this podcast leading up to RESO, and it seemed to accomplish its goal of creating awareness leading up to RESO. So glad you walked up and chatted, and we had a great conversation about just feedback on what people wanted to hear from the podcast and what you thought needed to improve. So here we are talking about one of those topics that we haven't yet, which is for the vendors that get the data and are providing their solution within a given market, what kind of things do they have to tackle next beyond just getting that contract done? So let's dive into it. Eileen, thanks for joining.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Excited to be honest. It's great to see you again too.
Good to see you. So let's kind of set the groundwork here. How did you find yourself in the industry? What was your first kind of foray into it?
Yeah, definitely. Well, out of college, I was working at a bank, actually. I had a finance degree. I was working as an analyst at a bank, and our bank was bought by Bank of America. So I had the option to move to Charlotte or take the pink slip. And I chose not to move to Charlotte. I'm in Chicago, or I was in Chicago at the time. So I had a couple of months severance pay after getting laid off. And I kind of thought, what do I want to do next? And banking was not the most exciting world. So what I actually did with that time was get my real estate license. So I got licensed and spent the next almost decade working in real estate, building a business and being a real estate agent.
Yeah, and what was your experience with that, and how did that eventually lead into you working in kind of the vendor landscape?
Yeah, well, I kind of inadvertently fell out of selling real estate. I became an agent. I was licensed in 2007. That's when I first got my license. So if you remember the history of the real estate world, that was the next couple of years were pretty wild. So those couple of years either made you or broke you as an agent, especially as a new agent. I amazingly made it through. And on the other side, say like mid 2010s, I was at the point where I'd kind of grown my business to, I was ready to hire an assistant, ready to sort of take it to that next level. And I was thinking, before I start to have to commit to paying somebody a salary and like go all in on this, I want to travel. So my husband and I left our jobs. He quit his job. I had a bunch of business and deals in the pipeline. I referred out to a couple other agents, and we traveled. We sold our car, rented out our condo, traveled for like 8 months. And when I got back, I was kind of just mentally removed from real estate sales. If you sell real estate, you know what I'm talking about. It is your life. It really consumes your life. And after having so much time away from that, I wasn't sure that I wanted to go back into that. So long story short, I started exploring other avenues and found myself in the tech space on this side of real estate. So
Yeah,
here
that's
I am
amazing.
now.
Where was your favorite place you traveled?
Someone just asked me this over the weekend. There's a lot of different favorites for different reasons, but one of my favorites was Bali, which seems kind of cliche, but it's just a beautiful, amazing place with a great vibe. We also did some amazing travels in Patagonia. If you're outdoorsy, it's worth the trip.
Yeah. So it's as good as it looks on Instagram.
100%. Actually,
Okay.
you can't even do it justice with a photo.
That's great. Cool. Now, let's get into kind of the meat here and lead into what we want to talk about today, which is kind of the MLS data landscape and as a vendor, what it looks like to work with that data. What was your first experience with MLS data? When did you start to realize what the network looked like and what you were kind of up against?
Yeah. Well, so when you are an agent or a broker, you don't, at least early on, you don't necessarily realize the complexities, right? You get your license, your managing broker says, sign this form, fill out this sheet, you need MLS access. And you're like, okay. You're not thinking too much about it, right? And you're so busy at that point building your business, building relationships, dealing with deals and contracts that you're not thinking about the complexities of real estate data, right? So honestly, I didn't know the extent of the complexity until I had my first role with a different startup, not Zenlist, but a different startup I worked for early on called TruePad. And that was really my first experience with, 500 plus different MLSs and MLS data feeds and compliance and that sort of thing. So I've been in it for a while now. And it's, every day there's something new to learn.
Yeah. Well, give us what you're up to today. Tell us a bit about Zenlist, and we'll use that context kind of going forward in the discussion.
Sure. Zenlist is a mobile first MLS front end solution for agent productivity. So the core of it is robust agent and client collaboration through search, tour scheduling, chat, communication, and listing input and edit.
Got it. Cool. Yeah, I love your all's solution. I came across it maybe a year ago, even before we met at the Chicago Association of Realtors event, and I thought it made a ton of sense. And I think one of the first reasons I came across it was that mobile first angle. We've at Simba built mobile first. I think that is where a lot of technology vendors really need to focus a lot of their product time and resources from the perspective of agents are always on the go.
Yep.
They're the most mobile salesperson there is. So
Yep.
mobile first makes a ton of sense. And so I think when we were really looking into the industry to see who else was building great mobile solutions, I remember you all coming up.
Mm-hmm.
So let's now talk about Zenlist is integrating with MLSs across the country, getting data feeds. Let's talk about kind of the intricacies here so that the audience, especially those startup vendors, can understand kind of what we're up against. And
Mm-hmm.
also for MLSs themselves to understand, what the effects of maybe their business rules or the unique data feeds that they give us vendors, what effects it has on our businesses, not just from a product perspective, but also from a business perspective.
Yep.
So talk about as a vendor within the MLS landscape, how do you interact with data feeds? Let's start there.
Sure. Well, we can start with how do we get data feeds, right? And there's a number of different types of data feeds from each MLS, and some offer a lot more types than others. It just depends on the MLS. There are typically a couple of main types. You've got an IDX feed, which is meant for I'm an agent or an office, I have a website, I want search to be on my website, public search listings, right? There's a VOW data feed, there's a broker back office data feed, and a number of others. But what's interesting about it is that our product doesn't always fit the mold of what sort of qualifies for either of these data feed types. We come closest to a VOW feed, and that's usually what we get. But you'll find that as in the tech landscape, as you're innovating and building new products that maybe haven't been built before, building solutions to problems that haven't been solved, you might not fit the mold. So for example, a VOW feed stands for virtual office website. It's really like the digital version of walking into a real estate office as a home buyer, right? You're walking into their office. The office has a sign on it. In the digital world, that's their office's URL, right? And they're getting information from an agent that they're working with about homes for sale or maybe homes that have recently sold, that kind of thing. So a VOW feed is meant to provide that same sort of service, just digitally. So we come really close to that, but we don't exactly fit that mold because everybody, agents and their clients, utilize Zenlist through a single URL, not through their own. So we're not technically building a VOW feed or VOW site for these brokers. They're utilizing our site as if it were sort of a VOW. So we don't always fit the mold exactly. And I'm sure there are a lot of prop tech founders out there that run into the same situation where they just don't fit the mold. So my best recommendation is to reach out to the MLS and understand, get a call with them and understand the different feed options and talk to them. They might do an audit of your product. They might want a demo of it. They might have to approve you for one feed type versus another, or sometimes they just say, pick which one you want, right?
Yeah. And you can go custom too. So if you don't fit one of them, in some markets you mentioned, we've got custom data feeds. We just let them know what's missing or what we need, and they'll help us out and give us more of a custom feed. Talk about that process.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and that's really the tough part because let's say you pick one of these sort of out of the box data feed types, right? You don't always know up front what you're getting. You can ask for a list of fields that you might be getting in that data feed. Sometimes an MLS is able to provide that for you, but not always. Sometimes it's their MLS vendor that handles that. So even once they've approved you for that feed type, they don't necessarily themselves handle that, send the transport of that feed to you in-house. So sometimes you may say, I'm going to get a VOW feed, but not exactly know which data you're getting until you get it. An example of that is we have some MLSs that send us attached documents through the VOW feed. So like on a listing, there might be property disclosures or floor plans or, a list of property updates, something like that attached. And so with some data feeds, we get that. With others, we do not. So we actually have to just evaluate what we've gotten once we receive the feed and then go back to the MLS and say, hey, we need this because this functionality within the system requires it, and work with them to add those things in. So it can be a process.
Yeah. And so when I hear that, I hear there might be an opportunity. I want to hear your thoughts on this for the MLS landscape and the MLS network and the individual MLSs to put better documentation out prior. It sounds like you have to go to the MLS, get a data feed, and then figure out, hey, does this fit or not? What does this look like within our environment? Is there an opportunity for MLSs across the country to maybe get out in front of that complexity a bit and provide vendors better documentation without you as a vendor having to even talk with their team? How does that help? Is that
Absolutely.
possible?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's huge value in still being able to have those conversations with the team and get to know the people at that MLS, because this isn't the end of it, right? The receiving of the feed is just the beginning of the communication you're going to have with those MLSs. So that relationship building is important. But yes, from just a resourcing standpoint and a process standpoint, having published information more clear for vendors right on a website or something like that certainly is going to benefit everybody and add to the efficiency.
Yeah, for sure. No, I totally agree that relationship with that vendor and having those discussions is important. Maybe that first discussion could be a little bit more productive if that data is out there.
Right.
So you get the data. You're now a custodian of that data. You have to take good care of it. You don't own that data. It's owned by that market, and people work very hard to make sure that that data is clean and getting to the right people. So talk about what it looks like to be a good custodian of that data. You get the data feed. What are some intricacies that you as a vendor need to make sure, whether it's verification of users, making sure that users are getting the right data? Talk about that process so we can dig into some details there.
Yeah, the verification of users is interesting because, in particular, with our product and with Valve feeds, it's usually that you need to sign in to an account to access the information. This isn't public search. This isn't public data. So I'm honestly not sure how other vendors like us handle that process. And frankly, I've never had an MLS say this is how you should verify. What we do is a two-step verification process where the agent creates a Zenlist account and then associates their MLS membership, or if they have multiple MLS memberships, they can associate multiple with Zenlist. And they'll put in their MLS ID number, and we then query the roster we get from the MLS to find that agent. And we send in a 6-digit code to the email address associated with that ID so that they verify who they are, that they are that agent, not just anyone can use their 6-digit code. So that's what we do. But we've run into, we ran into a unique situation once where in the data feed we got from one particular MLS, they did not include email addresses in the agent roster. And the idea there was they just didn't want vendors to be able to like nefariously use that data and market to their agents. Understandable. But it actually created for us a difficult problem because the purpose of us using that was to protect that MLS's data, right? So without getting into all the details, we created a workaround that works, but it adds extra steps for that agent. And it was work for us, work and resources engineering wise to build out an alternative verification process to protect that MLS data. So each case is unique. But you really have to, as a vendor, you have to think about it from the perspective of, the way you phrase it is perfectly being a good steward of that data. This is who we want to be able to access that data, and we need to do right by that, agreement.
Yeah. And it's not just who can access it, it's how they're accessing it, it's what data they're getting, and MLS's audit that. They're careful with that data. Talk about what an audit looks like. What should vendors kind of keep in mind about audits, and what have you experienced on that front?
Yeah. So there's a couple of things. Some of our MLSs do require like a demo account to be able to log in as both an agent and a client because our platform has two essentially different, similar but different interfaces. So they want to be able to check things like on the client account, the client can't view showing instructions. On the agent account is allowed to see the showing instructions, that kind of thing. So a lot of times we will give them like a demo login that they can use whenever they want, log in, check it. You see what you see and let us know if there's anything that we, slipped. We really haven't had any problems with that. There is another process too, though, which is that some MLSs will require us to send them an audit, I guess it's called, but really what that is a list of their users that are using our product. Okay. Each MLS is different. Some of them require this, some of them don't. This is usually the case in MLSs where we're allowed in that MLS to sign up any verified member of their MLS for an account. Versus an MLS that requires us to have the managing broker sign basically like a licensing agreement, or in some cases, it's like a contract addendum. And in those MLSs, they know who's using our product and where our data is being displayed. But in the MLSs where they're like, here's the feed, sign up anybody as long as you verify they're an agent of that MLS, they ask us to send them a list on some, regular cadence. Sometimes it's monthly, sometimes it's quarterly, what have you, of their agents. And the idea behind that is they want to be able to check that the agent site that is utilizing our data is, applying all of the rules. Again, this is kind of where we break the mold though, because we just have one site. So I can send them a list of 500 agents that are using, data through Zenlist. And for the MLS, they only really have to check one site. They only have to check Zenlist.com to make sure we're utilizing the data correctly. With another vendor, they might be going and actually checking every single agent's individual website in that case.
Yeah. And does that have any effect on your go-to-market? So in those two scenarios, you can go after the whole market, individual agents, or you have to go after the managing brokers based on what the MLS kind of allows you to do. How do you think
Yes.
about that? Because that
Yes.
sounds like a big nightmare when it comes to go-to-market.
Absolutely. 100%. And that's exactly how we operate. We are flexible in our go-to-market strategy because you have to be. There are some MLSs where we can distribute directly to agents, and we do. An individual agent can sign up for an account on their own. They can just find us and sign up. There are other MLSs where if I'm an individual agent and I just go to sign up on Zenlist, the system's going to block me. Because before being able to do that, we need to have a signed documentation from their managing broker authorizing that sort of val fee relationship or whatever it is in that circumstance. It does lead to some friction, right? I had an agent just 2 months ago probably who wanted to sign up in one of our MLSs. They messaged our support, said, why can't I create an account? This is so strange. And it was one of the MLSs where we needed to have our managing broker sign off first. And unfortunately, her managing broker was on vacation at the time, so she couldn't get on that day. And it was, it elongated things for her. So each market is different, but the key is to be flexible, right? So that as a product or as a vendor, you can distribute in whatever way that MLS allows for it.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's tough. So one of the things I want to talk about here was kind of the effect on the business. And on this topic, having that flexibility and going to market in different ways is really hard on a startup. We're limited in runway. We're limited in the amount of time we have to experiment with what's going to work and what's not. And when MLSs force us to do, different things based on different markets, we have to kind of spread our efforts and spread our focus. That really puts a lot of strain on our organization. It forces us to think really creatively when it comes to fundraising or how we're managing our burn rate and how we're hiring. And, the complexity of this industry and going to market really has a very negative effect on startups when it comes to scalability. And I think that's one perfect example where you have a customer ready to use it, wanting to use it, but there's a rule there that they can't.
Yep.
And unfortunately, the only key to that person getting access was on vacation.
Yeah.
And, that's tough for a founder or a leader of a go-to-market team within a startup to grapple with because we don't have the luxury of time.
Yep.
But, that's potentially just a reality of the landscape because it's so decentralized, fragmented, and unique from market to market. And hopefully we can figure out ways to make that better going forward. But another example you gave there was that agent that wanted to use it reached out to your customer support team and asked, hey, what's up?
Yep.
So talk about, the customer support effect, not just the go-to-market, but when it comes to a vendor, taking care of their customers or would-be customers from a customer support standpoint, how does this landscape affect that?
I mean, I knew you were going there. It's really tough. To be honest, you have, a support team who has to understand all of the different nuances of each MLS. And some of them are little nuances. Some of them are big nuances. We have a spreadsheet. We have a Google sheet that's shared among our support team. That's the simplest way to give everyone the information in a single place. I mean, that sounds so basic, but that's what we have. And there are specific columns for each kind of nuance that there might be. Can agents in this MLS just sign up? Things like that. And you need to have just really good, smart people who are able to identify when they get a support ticket in, is this question something that could be nuanced per market, right? And identify, what that nuance is. It causes quite a long and steep learning curve for a new employee. once they've mastered it, they're experts and they kind of have all this stuff in the back of the head, but it takes a while. And it's tricky. You can get tripped up. Even I get tripped up sometimes still. And I feel like I know almost all of the different nuances. They're just there in my brain, but it's tricky. So here's an example of one. Texas is a non-disclosure state, right? So that means that sale prices are not public information, right? Or not required to be, let's say. So in our data feed from Netris, which is the Dallas MLS, we do not get sale price data on closed listings. So we had a support ticket come in from a customer saying, why can't I see the sale price on this? Because agents will use Zenlist to send closed listings like comps to their client. Like, hey, this is what things are selling for around here. And in this case, the client couldn't see the sale price because that's how the data is in that market. So, a support ticket comes in like that could theoretically trip up someone on the support team if they didn't recognize like this is a specific thing for this market, right? So you really have to have documentation of all of those nuances and good, smart people who, can think about what is going on here at the core of the issue.
Yeah. So build a good knowledge base, make sure
Mm-hmm.
it's nuanced to each market, easily referenceable and searchable by, those employees, because there's no way that a new employee or customer support rep, even if they're experienced, can memorize all of that. So those are great tips for the vendors.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for MLSs, is there anything that is publicly displaying their business rules or even their own knowledge bases for vendors to suck in and incorporate into their own knowledge bases? Like a copy and paste. Is that existent? Could that be something MLSs could work on to make it easier on vendors?
Oh yeah, that would be great. That would be really great. Usually they usually have rules and regulations. Most of them, not all of them, but most of them have rules and regulations. Sometimes they're pretty hard to interpret, or sometimes the rules are sort of like come across as, subjective in some ways, depending on how you read it. So you have to be careful with that, but there definitely currently is not a simple standardized way of, absorbing all of the rules from all of the different MLSs.
Yeah. So to transition, we think we got a good landscape set. There's again a ton of nuance from market to market, whether it's the business rules, how the audits are done, how you track members, what the data feeds look like, whether you fit inside of one of the options or you need a custom one, and then kind of some of the trickle down effects on our businesses as vendors. Now let's talk about kind of grander scale here about how these things affect innovation as a whole. And I've gotten a good peek into this and some good perspective. And one of the things is, I mentioned it earlier, it's really hard for a startup to scale from market to market. And you have a great story about this. And the reason it's hard to scale is, again, as a startup, we really need to focus on our core competencies and our strengths. And when we have to deviate from those from market to market and change up our strategy, just again, market by market, that really makes it tough on a
Mm-hmm.
startup to scale. And they need a lot of runway. They need unique funding because the traditional venture capital space looks at this and says, I don't want to touch it.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you have large capital markets not wanting to touch and empower technology providers, giving technology to agents because that go to market hurdle is just too big, that hurts the agents. And the
Mm-hmm.
agents are the ones that at the end of the day are the ones that really are not being served to their potential because vendors like you and I have to deal with these things from market to market. And you gave a good example on our first call where you have a brokerage that has overlap in several different markets. They want to use the product, but there's complications there. Talk
Yep.
about this example and then kind of relate it to the grand scheme of innovation in this industry and why it's so hard.
Yep. Um, and I'll admit this is where personally I get frustrated sometimes, and this is my frustration comes from an agent and broker perspective. I mean, I don't sell anymore, but I maintain my license, and I'm a licensed managing broker, and I'm obviously very much still involved in the industry. So from that perspective, and that child in me that used to be an agent, it can be frustrating because I'll give you the example you talked about that we talked about earlier. I had two of them recently. These were both very similar in situation where they were brokerages who had under about 50 agents, okay? But they were in regions that there were a whole bunch of MLSs. So one of them had agents across 10 different MLSs. Many of these MLSs very small. And some of these agents were members of multiple MLSs. It was a jumble. And unfortunately, this guy loved Zenlist. He wanted to use it. This is exactly what I'm looking for. The ability for my agents to share their clients with each other, the ability for my agents to add multiple MLS memberships onto their Zenlist, all of these things. He's like, this is perfect. And I hate to say this, but in the end, we had to make the business decision not to work with him because for 50 agents, we couldn't support the rollout of 10 new MLSs. Now, if some of those MLSs were strategically, positioned for us or big enough that there was a very big addressable market for us, we maybe would have made the decision to. But in this case, it wasn't possible just from a business standpoint to support that or do that business. And sure, it hurt us a little, but it hurt him more. And I feel bad because you've got well, in this case, it was two different brokerages, but they're building these businesses. They're innovating. They're entrepreneurs. They're, crossing borders. They're growing, picking up new agents in their region, and they aren't even equipped. They're not able to be equipped with the tools that an innovative business in any other industry might have at their disposal.
Yeah, that's tough. And you said this, and it kind of hit me hard. Consumers have better data than agents when it comes to geographic, boundaries. The consumer can go to Zillow and look at homes. I'm in Kentucky here. I can look at homes in California and get a good amount of granularity on those listings through something like Zillow. The agents, they don't have that opportunity for their own businesses to go look at the granular data they need for that market.
Right.
That's tough. That's a unique kind of environment to play in as an agent that limits you geographically. But I get it at times. I see the nuances within each market and how an agent needs to be so well versed in their own individual markets. But when you have those boundaries where it's very fragmented in some regions of the U.S. where there's a lot of MLSs, I just personally don't see any excuses for that. I don't think that's very acceptable. And I understand that the industry is working on that and there's consolidation, but I think that needs to be improved as time goes on. And the other problem with it is when you there's the topic of, if you want to fix an industry, look at the incentives. And a lot of MLSs, they don't feel a lot of pressure or incentive to change quickly because if you think about it, agents in those markets don't have a choice but to pay for that MLS data. If they want to operate their business and want access to listings, they've got to pay that fee. And the problem is that those MLSs don't necessarily have a sense of urgency to change very quickly, because it's not like the agents are all of a sudden going to say, I don't like what my local MLS is doing. I'm not going to pay for their data any longer. I don't need this. The agents just don't have that choice. And so when you look at the incentives across the industry to move fast, have a sense of urgency, and innovate, it's not there. And it's frustrating and it's improving, but it's just objectively, it's not there. And I think that's a perfect case where this agent is being bottlenecked to run their business as effectively as they want because of those misaligned incentives and just the complexity of the MLS landscape. So I was looking forward to hitting on that point. Anything else you want to mention on that front?
Yeah. Well, so it's funny because there are, there's pros and cons to this situation where the MLS at its core, and I think the real value of the MLS and or the association, sometimes they're one and the same, is that those local nuances to how agents do business, right? So an agent selling cattle ranches is going to have different processes, different needs, different data types than an agent in Manhattan or an agent selling on the Atlantic coast or something like that, right? So it makes sense that there's some localization, right? And rules are based on local needs. That completely makes sense. But I know, for example, NAR is supporting some initiatives with encouraging statewide data shares, which makes a lot of sense because you are licensed at the state level. So, for example, I'm licensed in Illinois. Um, if I choose to be a member of MRED, I'm getting access to a lot of listings, probably Chicago area, Northern Illinois, some others. But let's say I work on the border and where listings are being input. I might need to join two different MLSs. And, still I might not be able to see within my two MLS systems all of the listings that my client's just looking at on Zillow. They're just looking on Zillow. And that's what really at Zenlist we're trying to solve, because if you're members of multiple MLS, you put them all in one place, and your client has one place too. But that idea of sharing data throughout the state across MLSs makes a ton of sense, so that an agent can actually do the business in the state they're licensed to do business, regardless of borders. Now, maybe there needs to be some restrictions on the agent only data, showing instructions, things like that, because now you're dealing with getting into somebody's property and there needs to be security around that. So I understand that. But just generally speaking, the data that can be public should be available to agents in the area that they're working.
Yeah. Yeah, and let's even expand it more. Let's say if you have a nationwide feed where agents that are licensed with, let's say, maybe NAR or some other group can have access to that, but whenever they access that data, those API calls are attributable to those local markets, and they have the business rules embedded. And basically what I'm getting at is, how do you remove boundaries but also attribute the data on a local level and allow there to be compliance on a local level, but access without the boundaries, for opening that up for the industry to, one, the vendors to have better access and to serve clients in a more scalable manner, but two, for the agents to have an informed decision along those borderlines. It might be within a state, but there's plenty of situations where an agent might have a client that is relocating and they're thinking about several markets at once. There's
Yep.
all kinds of scenarios where there needs to be some kind of better access on a nationwide level. And I think the challenge really is a technical one on how do you attribute that data locally and have the API calls attribute that. And maybe it's even pay. If you get an API call from a market on the other side of the country, microtransactions and tokens and these things are becoming very normal in the technology landscape. How do you pay for that one API call,
Right.
or those series of API calls that you're querying in those markets, and make sure that that local market gets paid,
Mm-hmm.
but they're not necessarily giving up all of the data that they have in that given market. It's just what that agent needs and is willing to pay for in that given period of time. So that's just an idea, just kind of
Totally.
brainstorming there.
Totally. I mean, I think we're making progress towards that. It's down the road. I mean, we're talking about 500 plus MLSs to all kind of move in the same direction. So we're making progress, and I think that progress starts with things like RESO and standardizing the data. Just like, let's at least get our data looking the same to start with, and then we can talk about sharing and attributing and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Dive into one thing I think vendors really need to get more accustomed to is traveling to, you mentioned RESO there. That's where we met. And I'm leading this into kind of a go-to-market question, but you go to conferences, you go to things like RESO, the California or the Chicago Association of Realtors event we went to. How should vendors think about meeting in person with the MLS landscape and the network across the country, and how has that helped grown your business and foster the relationships of those that you are getting data feeds from? How do
Mhm.
you think about those in-person connections?
They're so incredibly important. And maybe in any business that's important, but in this industry, being there, talking to people, meeting the people that you want to be working with or that you're starting to work with I mean, it's everything, right? putting a face to a name, building that trust, but also even just getting into the nitty gritty of things that are hard to like talk about over email. You can sit down with somebody and say, hey, explain to me what I can and can't do here, or why is this the way it is? Or here, look at this data we're receiving from you. Like it's missing this. Can we talk about how to adjust that? So sitting down with people is everything. And I'm glad that, the COVID world is behind us because it's nice to be in person and talking to people again. And it's extremely valuable. You have to be out there.
Yeah. And we've touched on a couple. So that's one go to market, in person events, fostering those relationships. It's necessary. You mentioned earlier going direct to agents and going to brokers. How have you thought about, as Zenlist has grown, that mix, and how do you invest as a startup, as a new founder, maybe coming into the space? They're thinking about go to market. I wish I knew this earlier before we started Simba, because it can be disorienting. You get
Mm-hmm.
into the market, you launch a product, and you're getting pulled in all these different directions, and it's really disorienting as far as where do I focus my time as go to market. How have you all thought about that, and how has it changed as you've grown?
It has drastically changed since our inception. And it, it just goes to show that there is a lot of different ways you can do this. You can go to market in this business. We started out direct to agent. Agents were subscribing to Zenlist on their own dime. They were, they saw this as an alternative tool for them to access MLS data and work with their clients. They were paying for it out of pocket. And what happened there is it grew. It was sort of an upward mobility where the brokerages said, what's going on? Our agents are paying for this product. We should look at this. Then we started distributing through brokerages. And that was, it's bigger, broader distribution much more quickly than individual agent to agent distribution. So that's great. Then it went up from there. We just did a partnership with the San Francisco Association of Realtors. We're an alternative mobile front end MLS system for those agents. So again, now we have even bigger distribution in a single market. Now that adds other complexities and changes sort of the relationship with your customers, but distribution is broader. The thing is, those broader distribution channels take a lot longer, right? I mean, you can sell to one single agent today in the next 10 minutes. Selling to a brokerage might take 6 months. Selling to an MLS might be a year in the making. So this goes back to what you mentioned with the runway. You really need to have that runway as a founder. But as a founder, I think the best thing you can do, because I don't have an answer on what the right way is, but the best thing you can do is talk to other vendors that are in a similar space or offer a similar but non-competing product, or maybe a similar business model. Talk to them and see what works for them. And this again goes back to the networking and those in-person events, because you can get those insights when you're talking to people. You go to dinner and you really get into the meat of how did this work for you?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's, what this podcast is trying to do too, is share these conversations, because
Mm-hmm.
when I came into the space, there really wasn't these conversations going on from a vendor perspective. A lot of conversations happen from, insider perspectives, those that have been in the industry for a long time. So I
Mm-hmm.
think that's where this podcast is super important. But touching on that more, is your all's product reliant on having MLS data, or is there an environment where somebody doesn't necessarily need MLS data to use your product?
Our product is, I mean, it truly is a front end option to access MLS data. So at its core, absolutely. I mean, the MLS data is what we serve up within the product. And then within it, agents work with it, organize listings, jot notes on listings with their client. They're doing things together with that data, but the core of it is the data.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the
Mhm.
big learnings that I've had at Simba was when we launched the business, we went straight to agents and we said, hey, here's the product. Does this solve a need for you? And the answer was yes. So we got paying customers that way. It wasn't until later that I wish I understood that maybe we framed ourselves a little differently. If I were to go over and start over again, I would probably frame it more as an MLS technology than direct agent at first, because looking back, our greatest distribution channel is through the MLSs, is through getting eventually access to that data, because a large portion of our product is reliant on MLS data. And I just didn't understand the landscape well enough when I started the business and first went to market. And, if we had maybe thought about how to go to market and frame ourselves as an MLS company, again, we would have changed how we look at our runway, our hiring, we would have
Yeah.
focused differently. But again, we're kind of in this disorienting situation where we're having to go so many channels to market because we didn't focus well enough, because we just didn't have the knowledge to do that earlier. And that's really tough on a business. And I think that when you start a company in this space, you really got to understand, do I need to build a product around agents, brokers, or the MLS? And the product needs to be built around that distribution model.
Right.
And I think that is one of the most important things, because in a lot of industries, you can build the product around the end user because they are your distribution. It's easy. You go to that end user, they're the decision maker, and they can make the call to purchase the product. For our cases, we've got to go to an MLS, talk to the executives. They put us in front of maybe a committee of technology task force, and then we get in front of their board, and then we go through the tech team to get the data feeds, and then we can start selling.
Yeah.
That's a totally different business. And when I entered the space, I didn't know that was the case. And so I think a lot of vendors need to look themselves in the eyes and mirror day one and say, what kind of business is this? Is this an MLS business? So we really an MLS vendor, and then we reach our end users, or are we going right to teams or right to brokerages? I think that's so important. That was a big lesson, that Simba's learned, and we're trying to right that ship. But it's been a struggle, and I think a lot of companies that I talk to struggle with that, because you don't know till really you're there. But if you've been in the game long enough, you can start to maybe get out in front of that. Or like you said, if you meet somebody at an event, or you hear this on the podcast, now technology companies can get out in front of that a little better.
You're not alone. I mean, I think there are way more founders and tech companies that weren't aware or hadn't thought of it from that perspective until they got into it and they learn. Hindsight's 2020. One of the things though is there's this fine balance, because you also have to identify product market fit. So you need to know that if it's agents that are going to be using your product, that the product works for them and adds value to them. So even if your distribution channel is at the MLS level, you still need to ensure that the product itself works for the end users. And that's where it's really tough, because how do you ensure product market fit with those end users if you're not distributing to those end users first, right? And so it is a balance, and finding the right people who are going to work with you and provide feedback, and people who are actually in the business and using the product in the way it would be used.
Yeah, a perfect example for us is we built for the agents first, again, acquired paying customers, and then we went to the MLSs. But going back to kind of the product that we've built and how it relates to you all, is we're mobile first. We're a mobile first product. Agents onboard and sign up on mobile. And the problem that we've had now that we have been able to launch as member benefits and MLSs and associations is the discovery point of our product is on desktop. It's within the MLS. It's within a newsletter. It's on the dashboard of the MLS. And here we are. We built a mobile first product.
Yeah.
And now we've got this conversion funnel where the discovery is happening on web. And now we're having to drive them through this onboarding process that is mostly on desktop and requires them to go through a paywall on desktop. And that is just one prime example of, again, you build around the distribution. When you go through the MLS system, you've got to have a web experience and an onboarding, whether it's SSO, whether that's just an easy onboarding that happens when they click on your tile, or they find you within the MLS and they can sign up and get into the account on web. Because the drop off that happens when they discover you on web and the MLS, and then you force them to an app, it's significant. And that's just one,
right?
It does. And that's just one small example of knowing the intricacies of going to market in this space and the difficulties of it are important. And, that affects everything from fundraising to how we hire and to how we do our, development sprints.
Yeah.
And it really is a unique industry to go to market in. So glad we can kind of talk about that, and hopefully vendors and new founders that listen to this can hear some of those things and avoid the mistakes.
Yeah, learn from us. But we have the same situation as you with the funnel between web and mobile. So I hear you. We support both for that's one of the reasons, right? So we have a front end web team of engineers and a front end mobile team of engineers so that we can support both. And that's another example of where, like, as a founder, if you're trying to run lean, it's difficult because you're supporting multiple platforms.
Exactly. We're exactly in that boat, and we're about to launch
Mhm.
a desktop version and see how that affects
Mhm.
conversion. And really, it's not only just conversion; it's how do you get the user to understand the value as early as possible, as quickly as possible, with the least
Mhm.
amount of work.
Right.
And again, when that onboarding is fragmented from web to mobile, that's tough.
Right.
Um, so, yeah, and these are all nuanced conversations, and they're so important to have. Every vendor's different. So hopefully, we can cover a lot of different cases here on this podcast. But I think your all's is amazing. You guys have great traction. I hear amazing things. Your all's app looks great. Again, when I got into the space and looked at other great user experiences, I immediately found you all and was excited to see others building mobile first. So appreciate you coming on, sharing Zenlist, sharing some of these examples of once you get the data, what does it look like from there, and then talking through go to market, because I think you all done a great job with that. So thanks.